Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. We are going back to our friend Alexis de Tocqueville because the very honest answer is I didn't know a whole lot about democracy in America and Alexis de Tocqueville, and he is a multidimensional person, and just doing one episode on him was not enough. So we're doing multiple, and I have Dr. Paul Carrese with me today. And Dr. Carrese, today we're going to talk about Tocqueville on political parties, which we do have kind of a whole little series on political parties in America, but now we're looking at how Alexis de Tocqueville kind of thought of it. So what does Tocqueville observe about political parties in his work, Democracy in America?
Yes, thank you, Liz. You are right. Democracy in America is a complicated work, but the better way to think of it is a very rich, enduringly important view about this big, complicated thing, America, the United States of America, our democratic constitutional republic, as he describes it. And it is an evergreen work in that even though it was published 190 years ago, it reads like it could be kind of a long form. You read a section of it, a chapter, it reads like it could be a long form journalism essay written last year or last week about some insight into American politics. And this is one of them, that parties will remain an important part of America, even though there's no mention of parties in the Constitution, nor in the state constitutions, and parties are a mixed thing. They're both bad and good. So Tocqueville is in part drawing on the view, you can see it in Madison, Federalist number 10, and we know he cites the Federalist regularly in Democracy in America. It's drawing on the view that parties are a problem. Or parties, the more political sciencey term is faction, right? That the problem for a democracy or republic is that you need the whole community to stick together, despite all the disagreements that free people have with each other, because there's a long record going back to ancient Athens and ancient Rome. Once you have parties and factions, they're ultimately self-destructive. They tear apart a free people, either because they come literally to the point of civil war with each other, or there's so much anger and disorganization and chaos, lack of civic unity, that some big bully in the neighborhood, a monarchy or an empire or somebody else, comes along and is able to overturn a democracy or republic. So that story was thousands of years old, and Tocqueville knew that, and Madison knew that. And so the reality Madison thinks is a free democratic republic in America can't do away with factions. How can we mitigate them, mitigate the effects of factions? And in a way, Tocqueville takes up that story. You would have to eliminate liberty or oppress liberty to a substantial degree to do away with the phenomenon of certain points of views about public policy issues or politics coalescing and forming into factions or parties. So Tocqueville's view is that the complex republic of America has enough features built into it. It's an extension of Madison's argument in Federalist 10. We are a federal republic. We are a republic, not a democracy. With those two elements, there's enough kind of complexity that America can deal with the reality of having parties, and parties won't go too far and become too extreme so that they're a threat to the perpetuation and existence of a common American Union, a common republic. Now, one difference, I think, from Federalist number 10 on the one hand and Tocqueville on the other hand is that Tocqueville does include some more of the negative language about parties, sort of the moral warning about the downside of parties. It's almost as if he had recently been thinking about reading Washington's farewell address, which has these famous warnings about the dangers of parties going too far. Of course, the party system that Tocqueville's talking about, that there's a kind of Federalist party, and then there's the Republican or Democratic-Republican Party, that arises in Washington's first administration and his second administration. So Tocqueville might be giving Washington some credit for warning about how parties can be just passionate and angry and narrow-minded and extreme and lose some sense of the common good. And that's clearly what's behind Washington's warnings in the farewell address. So Tocqueville's agreeing with Madison, and he doesn't literally cite Federalist number 10, but I think he's got it in his mind. But he's also bringing in some elements, I think, of Washington's farewell address to say, but beware about the moral danger of these things. And yet he has some good news for America that the kind of parties that have been so dangerous in Europe, like think of the party that takes over with the French Revolution, right? The Jacobin Party, and makes the French Revolution so extreme. Tocqueville's clearly got that on his mind, right? Tocqueville says about America in the 1830s, well, you know what? The era of those great or grand or revolutionary parties, that's over with. There was a grand party conflict. And he doesn't mention Washington's administration by name, but this is what he's talking about. The rise of the party system. It's the Federalist Party versus the Republican or Democratic-Republican Party. We would think of this as, Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson, and then the various other players involved. And Tocqueville says that's over with. Clearly, ultimately, the Democratic-Republican Party won, or the Democratic Party, the Party of Equality, won. But he also has this nice little kind of eulogy in Volume 1 of Democracy in America for the Federalist Party. Okay, they eventually lost. They're basically gone now by the 1830s, Tocqueville's writing. But boy, it was a good thing that Federalist Party was around because they basically produced the federal constitution, a more complicated form of government that has some non-democratic elements to it. And he doesn't name Washington or Franklin or John Adams by name, but he's got them in mind. He's the great founders of this constitutional union under the new constitution. They persuaded the people that there needed to be some tempering of some limits to some moderating of the democratic egalitarian spirit. So we have, these institutions like the Senate and a single executive as the president and the judiciary, which have survived into the 1830s. So to sort of tie this all up, right? Tocqueville's writing in the era of Jacksonian democracy in the 1830s. And he's saying the Democratic Party, the egalitarian Party of Equality, won the great party contest of the founding era. And yet we still have a party that is this Party of Equality. And then there's sort of smaller factions or parties that are still around. He doesn't even mention the Whig Party by name. It's like it's not even significant enough to even bother mentioning it. But the constitutional order also has survived into the 1830s. So this suggests to Tocqueville that while he does want to warn that parties are sort of in the spirit of George Washington, they're petty, they're small-minded, they're narrow-minded, they emphasize passions and narrow interests, not the common good, not large thinking needed. All the things we would talk about today, let's translate this to 190 years later. We talk about polarization and anger across two polarized, factional views about some political issue. And we talk about getting into silos and in your own echo chamber. And we especially talk about this with social media now, right? So, 75 years ago, we would have talked about it with newspapers. Tocqueville talks about newspapers being party newspapers and being narrow-minded and angry and passionate. So now we talk about, TV or media or social media being that way. He describes all of that kind of narrowness the sort of race to the bottom, anger, passion of politics. But, he says, the party of equality in the 1830s, the Democratic Party, the dominant party, has accepted the Constitution. They sort of moderated themselves to govern under the Constitution. So in this paradoxical way, he kind of continues Madison's argument. There's something good about this continuation of parties in America. There's a kind of activity and spirit of liberty to it that, despite all its downsides, maybe it's a good thing after all.
So then his comments on parties are part of Tocqueville's larger interest in this tension between the principles of equality and the principles of liberty in American politics, correct?
Yes, it's a theme throughout democracy in America that there are these two great principles from the founding, the spirit of liberty and also the spirit of equality or democracy. And again, he could have entitled the book A Constitutional Republic in America, which is what he's really a fan of. He thinks this is a great thing. The federal constitutional republic is a good thing, and then more democratic constitutions in the states. Great. That's a great package. But he knows that the energy of America, he's arriving in Jacksonian America, the democratic spirit of America. So he calls the book Democracy in America, and there just are repeated warnings about the spirit of equality going too far and democracy going too far, and how to keep alive this spirit of liberty, this principle of liberty, to keep the two in a kind of dynamic tension with each other. Now, he does have a warning about parties in the 1830s that is kind of a preview of what happens with the Civil War. He talks about the tariff controversy of 1831 to 1832. And I'm sorry for the listeners. Who cares about tariffs? It's totally irrelevant. Why would anybody be tied? It's like ancient history. Anyway, tariffs coming out of the federal Congress and the presidency about, regulating America's trade, trying to protect certain industries or products or things like that. The southern states are really angry about the tariff that's just passed. They think it's bad for their economy in the South, basically the slavery plantation economy. And there's a convention in Philadelphia in 1831 that Tocqueville writes about. And he says that this is what political association and parties and the freedom to form parties, this is what can happen in America. And it can be really dangerous, because the next year in 1832, the state of South Carolina takes it a step further and declares a principle of nullification. We're not going to respect and abide by this federal law about tariffs because it's unconstitutional. And Andrew Jackson comes down like a ton of bricks. The state of South Carolina says, you will not do that while I'm president of the United States, and basically threatens South Carolina. And then Henry Clay steps in and kind of brokers some deal. So Tocqueville, again, that sort of spirit from Washington and the farewell address observes what's happening in 1830 and says this could go too far. And he has some other parts of Tocqueville's of Democracy in America where he says, maybe the slavery issue it could threaten the continued existence of the federal republic. So if you put these passages together, you might say, well, why doesn't Tocqueville just completely come down on the side of Washington and say parties are bad? Okay, the Federalist Democratic Republican Party, that conflict from the 1790s, that's over with. Why do we need any parties at all? But he doesn't say that. And it's because, I think, of this concern about the spirit of liberty. So he says that the contestation between different factions and parties, yes, the Democratic Party is dominant, but there are these parties and factions that arise at particular policy issues. We know going forward that the Whig Party basically dissolves and the Republican Party replaces it. All of that activity and ferment is better than not having it, because he's worried that the principle of equality will become so dominant that the health of America may survive, but it may be this sort of shell of itself where citizens don't really care about politics and citizens don't care to be participating in politics. So even though there are all kinds of dangers to parties, there's still something better about having them around than not.
So you were suggesting that Tocqueville extends Federalist 10, like that analysis of faction and parties, while he notes the dangers that parties pose. There is a larger problem with civic apathy and government centralization that parties could help address.
Yes, so two big concerns, and you've already done an episode, I think, right, on Tocqueville about individualism and the kind of civic apathy as a problem. And Tocqueville, many listeners might know of Tocqueville writing on associations and the good thing that Americans form associations and join associations and get active in civil society, sort of the private side of civic life. But he also connects that to political associations and Americans being active, they sort of blend and bleed into each other. Civil society and associations, what Robert Putnam writes about, but bowling alone being a problem. So associations on the civil society, private side are in the same culture with the culture of parties and political associations, which, can be sort of factions and narrow-minded interest groups, what we call them, on the negative side. But Tocqueville thinks being involved in that way in politics, even if you get riled up and angry and passionate and narrow-minded, it's better than sitting on your sofa and just, watching TV or doom scrolling or being totally isolated. Of course, he doesn't know about those technologies, right? But being totally isolated in your own little life, your family, your friends, maybe not even your family, right? It's better to be engaged and riled up about politics than to be isolated and apathetic and let somebody else deal with government. I don't really have to be a self-governing citizen. So that's one dimension to it, putting together political associations, parties with a strong, healthy civil society and civil associations. All of that he wants to encourage. And so one danger is civic apathy. The other danger is majority tyranny. So the spirit of equality becoming so dominant that if a Democratic majority persuades itself and the government persuades itself this is the right thing to do, then laws can be passed that violate the rights of minority groups or of individuals, just what Madison warns about in Federalist number 10 with factions and parties. So here again, there's this kind of paradoxical argument, just like Madison has a paradoxical argument. Well, Tocqueville says, having parties around can complicate political life so it blocks majority tyranny from occurring. There's enough space to dissent, to disagree, to persuade. So he's trying to encourage the Americans to use parties as peaceful, law-abiding modes of persuasion. He warns about what happened with the tariffs in 1831 to 1832, but hopes that Americans can form political associations, factions, parties, even one big rival party to the Democratic Party, the Party of Equality, right? And they can do it in a peaceful way. It won't ever become the revolutionary, violent parties that occur in Europe. But also, again, we know the end of the story. What happens in the 1850s is eventually you get, how to describe it? A party morally concerned about abolition. That faction forms in the United States. And the pro-slavery party, has to be more and more explicit to oppose anything like abolition, saying that, the Declaration of Independence was just phony. It was always phony. No rational person ever believed in equal natural rights. There are always superior people and superior races. That was just then. We needed that in 1776, right? So you get this polarization, the party of abolition, party of pro-slavery. Tocqueville doesn't quite describe that, but he, sees the danger of the Union splitting up over slavery. But still, to Tocqueville, the risk of the downside of parties and factions is better than going down the railroad tracks of apathy, civic apathy and individualism, where you don't care about self-government. And the risk of parties and all the ferment and activity of political parties is better than majority tyranny, being accepted, especially dominant governmental views, without any dissent and contesting of those kinds of political views. I will add one more thing for the really nerdy people in the listening audience. Tocqueville is drawing on Montesquieu, The Spirit of Laws, a chapter in The Spirit of Laws. It's in book 19. It's on the English Constitution, in which Tocqueville talks about the political culture of the English constitutional order of liberty with its separated powers. There's the legislative power and the executive power, the judicial power. What's it really like? And he talks about parties there. And Montesquieu says all the negative things about parties and factions that Madison mentions and that Tocqueville mentions. But Montesquieu says, but it's still better that there's this ferment, even some of it is angry and stupid and narrow-minded, because at least the English are interested in being self-governed and self-governing. That's better than just leaving government to, the nobility or to the experts or to a few people. Tocqueville's really carrying on that kind of spirit of argument, and he's applying it to America. So parties for Tocqueville are a kind of mixed thing, but it's better to have them and make the best of them as long as you can persuade people to stay within the rule of law and to stick to reasonable persuasion and not go anywhere near revolutionary parties and violence.
Wonderful. Dr. Carrese, thank you so much on this deep dive with Alexis de Tocqueville and political parties.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.